introduce this class. This is the second session of Habits of the Heart, Rabbinic Perspectives on Human Temperament and Character with Rabbi Alex Israel, who, if you're not familiar with who Rabbi Alex Israel is, he is a teacher and lecturer and author. He is at Eretz HaTzvi and Midrashet Lindenbaum, as well as one of the recorders on the 929 podcast, the Tanakh podcast. Born and raised in London, he is now in Alon Shvut. And this class is going to examine rabbinic voices on our human traits and dispositions with sources from across the rabbinic and philosophical spectrum. Just one housekeeping note, I will be sending invitations to panelists, the people on the Zoom call shortly. And if you are able to accept it, I strongly recommend it. You can unmute yourself independently, directly ask questions, turn on your camera, which helps make for a nice Beit Midrash environment. I strongly recommend it as an option. But we do want to hear from you, even if you aren't a panelist. Please feel welcome at any time to ask questions in chat, both on Zoom and on Facebook, and I will bring them to the attention of Rabbi Israel. And as he starts teaching, I will post sources in chat on both platforms. And with that, I want to hand things over to Rabbi Alex Israel.
Okay, so hi everyone. Hi Sandra, hi Alyssa, and anybody else who is listening. Delighted to be with you all. We are in our second class. Last time we did a little introduction and spoke about gratitude. And so today we're going to take a new topic, and I will share my screen. So we're going to talk about the notion of speech and silence. Before I even get onto the topic and start sharing, I'd like to maybe make a comment which I think is worthwhile making, which is that, some people, when you talk about speech and silence, they're quite sure that they're in for a drasha about Lashon Hara. And I'm going to spend the class telling you how awful you are for speaking Lashon Hara, and that that's what it's all about. So I just have news for you that's not what our aim is. Sorry, I'm just trying to get this glare out the way. I can't manage to. I'm recording in my parents' apartment, and they've got this lighting which is causing a glare, so I apologize. Anyway, so we're not going to be talking about Lashon Hara, but I actually would like to start off by maybe saying something about Lashon Hara, and that is that I'm a firm believer that it's sort of funny. People have an impression that Lashon Hara is something which you can't overcome. Lashon Hara is something that everybody is flawed at doing, and we're going to be stuck in that syndrome for all time, and it's not something that anybody can sort of work on. So I think I used to have that attitude, I've got to be honest. I think I used to be thinking that it's everybody talks Lashon Hara, and the truth is, and then I met my wife. Now my wife insists that we don't talk about people at the table. We all know that the pastime of most shul-going Jews is that you hear the rabbi on Shabbos morning and you spend Shabbos lunch talking about him. And people frequently are talking not always positively about the rabbi. My wife, when I married her, she had this strange rule that we don't talk about people at the table. So we can talk about things, we can talk about ideas, we can talk about current events, we can talk about all, but we don't need to talk about people. And if the conversation turned to the rabbi or to any other person in the community, I would get this very stern look from my wife, and we would if I didn't change the topic quickly enough, or if she didn't, then I might even get a little nudge under the table to tell me that it's time to change the topic. And she really insisted that we don't go in that direction. So I just would like to say that it's possible, that it is possible And so what we're going to try and do today is to be a bit more sophisticated about this. And I want to introduce this to you with something really cute that I discovered. Let's share the screen. Sorry, 1 second. Here we go. I hope you can see this. I'll make it a bit bigger if I can. Hold on a minute. 1 second. Let me just play around here a little bit. Here we go. All right, this is a bit bigger. I hope that's good. And so what you can see, this is from a very famous Benjamin Franklin. And the amazing thing about this schema, which you see on your screen, you can see even the page that Benjamin Franklin used, is that, in fact, this schema, which Benjamin Franklin invented, was apparently used by Rabbi Salanta, the founder of the Musar movement, would you believe? That apparently we find the same, and one imagines that Benjamin Franklin did not learn it from Rabbi Salanta. The assumption is that it worked the other way around. So I want to just read this with you by way of introduction, and then we'll see what we can do. Hold on just 1 second. Just dealing with a bit more housekeeping. Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay, so here we go. So I'll read with you a little bit, okay? He says, it was about this time that I conceived of the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. That's quite a bold and arduous project, I've got to say. I wish to live without committing any fault at any time. I wonder how many of us can say that. I wanted to conquer all that either natural inclination, custom, or company might lead me into. First of all, I love that. There's natural inclination, there is custom, and company. In other words, we all get born with traits, things we're stronger at and weaker at. Then there are things which we've got into bad habits. And then the third thing is we get influenced by the people around us. So all of those things, right, he said, might have led me into bad habits, my natural inclination or custom, things that I've got into bad habits, or company. And he created 13 names of virtues, all that at the time occurred to me as necessary or desirable, and annexed to each a short precept which fully expressed the extent I gave to its meaning. The names of the virtues of the precepts were, let's just take a look at what he puts. Temperance, by which he means eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. In other words, watch what you eat, watch what you drink. Silence, and this relates to ours today. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversation. Love that phrase. Okay. Order, let all your things have their places, let each of the business have its time. Resolution, by which he means to resolve to perform what you ought, perform without fail what you resolve. Frugality, okay? In other words, don't waste. Industry, use your time well, okay? Cut out unnecessary actions. Sincerity, okay? Justice, wrong none by doing injuries, omit the benefits that are your duty. Moderation, avoid extremes. Love the spelling. Cleanliness, tranquility, by which he means be not disturbed at trifles or at accidents common or unavoidable. So don't get flustered. Chastity, interesting, and humility. I'm not going to recommend that everybody here imitate Jesus and Socrates, as he says, but humility anyway. Anyway, these are his 13 traits. Now, what does he do? If you can see, he's got this table. And what he says is he's going to take a trait. Here, you can read it here. I made a little book. I ruled each page with red ink so as to have 7 columns, one for each day of the week, marking each column with a lesson for the day. I crossed those columns with 13 red lines, and in its proper column I mark by a black spot every fault I found upon examination to have committed, respecting that virtue upon that day. So basically, if he's made a mistake about cleanliness, if he left the kitchen messy or whatever it is, then he puts a spot there. And basically, he marks all of his flaws. And he says, determined to give a week's strict attention to each of the virtues successively. Thus, in the first week, my great goal was to avoid every least offense against temperance, leaving all other virtues to their ordinary chance. And basically, I'll I'm highlighting where I'm continuing. Proceeding thus to the last, I could go through a course complete in 13 weeks and 4 courses in a year. And like him who, having a garden to weed, does not attempt to eradicate all the bad herbs at once, and would exceed his reach and strength, but works on one of the beds at a time, and having accomplished the first, proceeds to the second, so I should, I hope, be happy in viewing a clean book after a 13 weeks daily examination. In other words, he says, let me do them once in turn. Each week I'll focus on a particular midah, a particular trait, and then hopefully over 13 weeks I'll have worked hard on them. And in a year I'll have gone through each one four times, and who knows what progress I can make. So first of all, I've got to say, somebody might say that this is a little bit, too detail oriented and too controlling. But what I find fascinating about this is the notion of, I don't know how many of you are into journaling or how into, but I think if you want to make a change, you have to track things. I certainly find this if I want to, I don't know, for example, let's say I found in the first couple of months of the war, I was eating far more chocolate and cake that I was binging to, to somehow stop myself from thinking about things I didn't want to think about. So, if I want to lose weight, I've got to make sure that I, get to the gym X number of times a week and be careful that I don't snack at night. And the best way for me to do that is to track it, right? And weigh myself once a week or something like that, and make sure that I'm going down and not up. So that's really what we're saying about all of the traits that you have here, right? Whether it's temperance, silence, order, resolution, frugality, industry, and fascinating the things that he chooses here. So I guess what I want to say, since we're still at the beginning of our course about habits of the heart and about midot, that if you want to improve in something, you do have to track it. And this is what I learned from Ben Franklin here, that a person can actually, if they pay attention to something enough and make it enough of a project, they can really conquer it. They can improve it. There's nothing which is beyond any of us, but we have to, make it a project. And as a project, one of the things to do is to, have some sort of track of how my behavior is, and to think a little bit why I'm behaving like I'm behaving, etc., etc. Doesn't mean it'll always work, but at least that's a way to begin. Okay, so all of that was by way of introduction today. And now let's go on to our topic. I don't know if anybody wants to add anything at this point, but if you do, please let me know.
Just, thank you to Minda L for, catching on to the Pirkei Avot in the Q&A. You were onto something.
Okay, so, all right, so let's take a look. And today we want to talk about speech and silence. And I'm quite fascinated by this topic. Let's take a look, and let's begin with a challenging text from Pirkei Avot. Shammai. We always talk about Hillel as the good guy and Shammai as the bad guy, so to speak. So let's talk about Shammai. First of all, Shammai Omer Aseh Torat Chakeva. Make Torah study a fixture in your life. I think we can sign off on that. And he says, Emor ma'at va'aseh harbe. Right? Say little and do much. Which one of our ancestors, which one of our patriarchs do we usually associate that with? Anyone? Emor ma'at va'aseh harbe. So Rashi always points us to Avraham with this. That Avraham was the one who said, just take a little bit of water and wash your feet, but then he goes off and bakes bread and, with great industry, slaughters an animal. So Avram's the guy who spoke little, but did a lot. Be a doer. So Shammai would say, make your Torah study a fixture of your life. Don't say so much, but do a lot. And having a mikabel kol adam b'seva panim yafot. So first of all, I find that very interesting, that Shammai is actually the one who said, greet people pleasantly, right? We always think that Hillel was the friendly one, but apparently Shammai was quite friendly too. But here's something interesting. Think think about that, if that makes an impression on you. What are we saying about language? Or maybe we're not saying about language. Maybe we're saying the ratio between language and action. Now, keeping on this theme of speech and silence, let's keep going. We're going to meet Rabban Gamliel in Mishnah. That was Mishnah 15. In Mishnah 16, we meet Rabban Gamliel, who was actually affiliated with the school of Shammai, right? And he says, "Asay lecha rav, istalek min hasafek, v'lo tarbeh la'aser umadot." He's all about, by the way, precision, right? Assume for yourself a master, get yourself a rav. Why? So that you can stay away from doubt and don't do anything by estimation. He's very precise. But his son, Shimon ben Gamliel, said this. Now, I want to say something. Anybody who's called Rabban, as opposed to Rabbi or Rav, anybody who's called Rabban is the Nasi. The Nasi was like the head of the community in Eretz Yisrael. So you've got a guy who grew up in the house of the Nasi, grew up in a house of politicians, also a rabbi, but also a politician. I imagine many people came through his door. And Shimon ben Gamliel says, Kol yamai gadalti ben hachachamim. I've been raised amongst the wise, but maybe he means the rabbis, all my life. V'lo matzati leguf tov el hashtika. I love that statement. I've grown up in the house of the Nasi, but the best thing is silence. So many people come and talk a lot. I think the best thing is silence. And then he says, V'lo hamidrasha ikar ela ha'ma'aseh. The most important thing is not study, but rather deed. Anybody who speaks excessively brings sin. So I find this fascinating because we have this tendency amongst Shammai and amongst Shimon ben Gamliel to, first of all, talk about the important thing is action. For Shammai. And Shimon ben Gamliel is saying, Lo hamidrasha ikar. The most important thing is not study, but doing. But Shimon's first statement is, I've grown up in a house of rabbis, and you'd do very well just to be quiet. And then in the last statement, anybody who speaks excessively brings on sin. So I wanted to throw this out to any of you who are on this call, and to what do we think about this? Is speech so bad? We have to say little and do much. We should only, again, an interesting phrase, by the way, lo matzati laguf tov el hashtika. What does it mean? The body is good with silence. Is it a physical thing? Does he mean to the person, or does he mean to the body? I have found nothing better for the body than silence. I don't know. Lo matzati laguf. And this idea of kol hamarbe dvarim mevi chet. If you speak excessively, you bring sin. What do we think? What do you want to say about this? Anybody? Comment?
I'm happy to unmute you if you want to speak directly.
Oops, hold on. Okay. Sandra, you want to? Yeah, Sandra.
Certainly, it goes back to my mother's old adage, which is, you can think it, but not say it. I hear her actually saying that. Not everything that comes into your head needs to be spoken. Now, of course, being a litigator for 25 years, that sort of belies the scope of what you have to do. But basically, on a midot level, if you don't say it, they can't hang you for it. On the other hand, if you don't speak up, how do you express yourself? How do you hear yourself? On the other hand, look what happened to Moshe at the burning bush. What did he bring up 4 or 5 objections to God's having chosen him? And each one, of course, was dealt with summarily. So I see that caution is really what's called for, and it's troubling.
Right. Put a filter on it, right? I sometimes think about our world. I think about our world. We have so much, we have on our Facebook feeds or so much word, so many words. Sometimes I look at the newspaper, I think, gosh, how how many words, so much language all around, banter, talk. It's actually one of the things in this war that I haven't been able to stand, all the talk shows, as if everybody knows what they're talking about. If they all knew what they were talking about so well, then maybe they would have warned us what Hamas were up to. All these so-called experts, how expert are they? So I do wonder about that. But I'm just throwing this out there, this notion that, first of all, the relationship between what we say and what we do, that sometimes we try and make an impression and we say it sound very good, but do we follow up, right? If you're going to say it, better make sure that you back it up with words. And that sometimes speaking excessively is just really inappropriate. I can't help thinking about Shimon ben Gamliel, who sat by his father's side, the Nasi, and he heard so many people pontificating about so many things. And he says, I've been raised amongst the Chachamim, and some people should just shut up. And I just, it really makes me wonder, this whole, just from a human level, Shimon ben Gamliel. So let's begin with that. I put here a Rabbeinu Yonah, but before I get to it, let's look at source number 3. And here we have, again, Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who, and clearly this is staged because nobody does this really, but Shimon ben Gamliel famously had a servant called, who we know his name. His name was Tavi or Tubby. And one day Shimon ben Gamliel says to his servant, "Seo kaneli ma'achal tov min hashuk." Go get me something good from the market. And of course, and the servant goes and he brings back some tongue. And then he said, go get me something bad from the market. That's why I say it's staged, because whoever tells their servant get something bad from the market. So he said, go get something bad from the market. And what does Tavi go get? He was a very clever man. And he said, tongue. And Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel says, see, mimenu hatova umimenu hara'ah. So apparently it wasn't only silence. From there is the good and there is the bad. When it is good, there is nothing better than it. And when it is bad, there is nothing worse than it. So this idea that our language is very powerful, and we can use our language for good and for bad. And we're going to talk about that in a second. Now, in analyzing this concept that Rabbi Shimon Gamliel talks about, I brought the Rabbeinu Yonah, who has a lovely commentary on Pirkei Avot, and let me just read a little bit about it, because it's actually going to take me in a direction that I don't want to go, but it's worthwhile mentioning even things that I'm not so interested in. Rabbeinu Yonah says this, source number 2. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel hardly needed to advocate silence. A person knows to guard themselves from harm. However, even non-damaging positive speech, such as a person talking about their work, bodily needs, or livelihood, should be minimized, especially if the talk is simple banter, which has no higher benefit. So this is extreme. I'll say, and I'll explain to you why I have a hard time with it in a minute. But Rabbeinu Yonah is claiming that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel was quite extreme in his reticence to engage in speech. He said banter, talking about, Paranasa, the economy, talking about, your health or work should be minimized, unless it has a importance. And he quotes Reish Lakish in the Jerusalem Talmud, who said, if I'd been at Mount Sinai, I would have requested 2 mouths. And then he said, with only one mouth, I can't stop myself from evil speech, all the more with 2. But he meant to say that he wanted 2 mouths so that he could speak from one mouth words of Torah and words that are completely vain things of the world in the other mouth, in the same way the holy sages would make themselves like holy vessels, which are not to be used for profane matter. And that is what we say in the Talmud, all chatter is bad except for Torah chatter, which is good. So I just wanted to point out that maybe what's happening with Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is that Rav Shimon ben Gamliel is looking for a degree of sanctity. Now, I don't know if we all want to become tzaddikim, if you understand what I mean. Some of us just want to be normal people. So I want to divide something, but I want to divide between what we might call harmful speech, lashon ra, bad speech, and then one can say, just like there's a concept of bittul Torah, which is maybe good for the yeshiva, but doesn't always work for all of us. Maybe what Rosh Ben Gamliel really wanted was to be holy, and he didn't like the idea that he had to use his mouth for good and bad. He wanted to live a sacred, secluded life that was sort of more the Bet Shammai way than the Bet Hillel way. And part of this silence is a sort of a withdrawal from the world. So I'm just pointing that out, but I don't know if this advocacy of silence is something that we necessarily want to do. Maybe it's for people who particularly want to be, achieving a degree of holiness, withdrawal. To this phrase here, our holy sages would make themselves into holy vessels, or in the Hebrew, Chachamim HaKadoshim hayu osim atzman klei sharet she'ein mishtamshim bahem b'dvarim shel chol. They'd be like temple vessels who are not to be used for the profane, But I don't know if that's an ethic which most of us want to be. Some people want to have lives of phenomenal sanctity, but I don't know if that's all of us. So I'm just pointing that out because I think it frames the topic from a certain vantage point. But I'll go back to this idea where Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, the notion of his Tavi who went and got tongue for good food and tongue for bad food, that the tongue can be used for good or bad, right? And let's try and talk about this a little bit. And if I had the ability to, if I had more people on the call, and I would divide everybody at this point up to what we'll call them breakout groups, and discuss this. When I teach this class in Midrash at Lindenbaum, that's what I do at this point in the class. I'll read from this Alan Marinis from his book Everyday Holiness, and he says the following. He says, I regularly conduct students in an exercise in which I pair people up and direct them to relate to their partner. One instance in the last week where they said something or heard something from someone that reflected negatively on another person who was absent. The point is not to assess whether or not the facts in the conversation were true, but simply whether derogatory, potentially damaging speaking took place in your presence. What Alan Marinis claims in his book is that he's done this hundreds of times, and he asked people, have you heard something said about somebody who wasn't there, where somebody said something negative in your presence about somebody who wasn't there? And he claims that everybody has experienced this. But I thought that was a little negative. So I devised a different exercise, which I'll just share with you. And I asked people to, if it's in source number 5, sit with a friend, reflect on the past week or weekend, and ask, are there any instances in which you've been insulted by speech? If you've been offended, if you have offended or insulted others in their presence or in their absence, or if you've experienced praise or given praise, if you've been boosted by the way a person has spoken. Because of course, what does Tavi say? That speech can be positive or speech can be negative, right? So I think that's an interesting thing. If we started our class by saying that we should track things and record things, right? So I put the question here. Do you find the environment with your friends is positive, negative, or neutral when it comes to speech? Do you give praise? Have you experienced praise? Right? Have you been insulted? Have you insulted others in their presence or in their absence? And I think it's easy to do in the company of somebody, because I think that way things come out that you wouldn't otherwise say. But I find this quite fascinating that this might be something that we could do a little bit of cheshbon hanefesh. Again, I'll talk totally personally. We were sitting with some friends some time ago, and as I said, we're usually very careful about speaking about other people. And we found that we were talking about friends in common, and the conversation kept on going in the negative direction. I kept on trying to change the topic, and I was really not successful. So it's interesting that sometimes with certain friends, with certain people, the conversation turns to people, other friends not. So I'm just raising that as a point, how does the culture of language where we are, how does it affect us? Okay. But let's get into something totally different. And I'd like to talk about two things which are going to take things in a more positive direction. And the first one is about silence. And this is from a book called Alei Shor, source number 6, by somebody called Revolba. And Revolba is like a modern Musa master. And he's going to advocate silence, but not in the way that Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel said. So let's read a little bit together. And again, if anybody wants to comment, that would be lovely. Oh, I see some comments. Hold on, I'm looking in the chat now. Oh, okay, fantastic. Here we go. I will say to anybody who's writing in the comments, I don't have the chat open, so I only open it as I can't do too many things at once. So I apologize if I don't notice comments in real time.
Actually, just a comment to bring up from the questions and answers from Minda L. Noting a few minutes ago, asking, is chol referring to profane or secular?
Yeah, this is relating to source number 2, where the question was, so I actually understood it there that Dvarim Shel Chol was more secular. Yeah, here it's translated as profane. And I would also agree that it's more for secular matters rather than profane. So it's a good question. Okay, let's go to source number 6 and let's see what we can do. And here we go. Says Revolba. By the way, Revolba was lived in Bayit Bagan. If I'm not mistaken, he was one of the mashgichim in the Kol Torah Yeshiva. He wrote a book called Alei Shor, which is seen as a very, very perceptive book, psychologically perceptive book, and a book which really helps people work on their character. And he says this: silence and solitude are connected. A person who knows how to be silent loves isolation. Interesting statement. A person who doesn't know the art of silence flees from being alone. There is no intent here for a person never to talk or to live in eternal solitude. Such an extreme is not the way of Torah. We're talking about people who are social, happy, active in the throes of life. Exactly this person needs to love an hour of isolation and silence to designate such time. Some people escape from moments in which they're alone as if from fire. In those moments, they suddenly confront, face to face, a foreigner who they've no interest to get to know. They run away from him. Because at such a moment of silence, a person faces his own self, his or her own self. And such people are distant from themselves. So he says, if we run away from silence, that's a sign that we don't know how to live with ourselves. And he says an intelligent person seeks an hour of aloneness so he can come closer to himself and his inner world. This isn't piety. Any healthy social person feels a need once in a while to be alone with oneself. And without fulfilling this need, one causes oneself damage. It's quite an amazing statement. Out of the solitude and silence grows the power of thought. The inner intelligence is strengthened, and the intelligence of speech withers. And he concludes and says, if it were not for the night, we'd never know about the stars. So it is with our inner world. When we're with other people, our attention is directed to earthly matters, but by taking an hour out and shutting the world out from our consciousness, then the heavens that exist within our soul, within our personality, are revealed. A spiritual space is open before us. Distant worlds twinkle at us like stars and arouse with us love and fear, yearnings of holiness and kindness. Without a graceful moment of solitude, we wouldn't know any of these things at all. And I have to say, I love this. I sometimes have the experience when I'm in the car that I'm listening to the radio and I, want to turn it off because I don't like what's on. And then suddenly there's silence in the car. And then I find myself sometimes within 30 seconds turning the radio back on or taking my phone and making a phone call. And I wonder sometimes, what's wrong with being quiet, Truth is, I find it easy to do that quiet thinking when I'm exercising or when I'm walking. Somehow, when my body's busy, I find it easier to have that quiet time. I don't like walking with earphones through the street. I much prefer to take everything in, or to walk through nature, listening to things and being aware of my environment. But I find it fascinating, this idea that, especially in an age with cell phones, we constantly, when you're waiting for a meeting, you just wait and study the people around. And now we're always checking our emails or our WhatsApps or every other thing we have. So I wonder about Ali Shor telling us that silence is something useful for ourselves, not because it brings sins, not because it creates kedusha, but because it enhances us as people, right? And that's a completely different type of silence. Okay, Sandra, yeah.
If I could just, I apologize for just bringing in something very personal that I've thought about for the last 30 years since my parents passed away. I wasn't listening to music during the 11 months after they died. And it was a time when I was picking up my kids, taking them, dropping them off, picking them. And as you say, in the car, radio was on all the time, except not for those 11 months. And I remember vividly the silence in the car and the thoughts I had. Literally remember the car, what I was wearing, where I was driving, and it has stayed with me for 3 decades. And whenever I feel a little overwhelmed, I just go to that space. And as I think Rav Wolbe says so beautifully, that's a place where maybe you have opened, and maybe the rabbis were so smart to advise this. Maybe that was the reason, to allow us, instead of filling ourselves with stuff, to encourage the silence. And what does he say? Allow a spiritual space to be opened. Right. And so I really wanted to.
I wonder whether that's what the Mishnah means when it says "V'lo matzati laguf."
Laguf, exactly. I was thinking that precisely. I think, wow, pretty smart. Pretty smart. You don't need me to revalidate Pirkei Avot, but there it is.
But somebody once told me, I remember when I was younger and going out with my wife or whoever it was, or when we were all sort of like thinking about marriage, somebody once said an interesting statement. They said, you'll know you found the right person when you enjoy being silent together. And this also reminds me that there's nothing comfortable about a silence when you feel comfortable with one another, such that you can be silent together. And I think that's, something, which, and I'll just read out what Richard Skeen says here. He says, this seems to suggest that silence is necessary to make room for authentic prayer. Is this a basic thought amongst the rabbis? So I want to just relate to that. There's a wonderful teacher of prayer called Rabbi Dov Zinger. Some of you might have come across his name. Rav Dov Zinger is the Rosh Yeshiva, the high school principal of the Makor Chaim Yeshiva, which has created a speciality in spirituality education, and with people getting in touch with their inner spirituality. And one of the things that he does amazingly is he teaches about prayer. He's written a book called Matkonei Tefillah. You can look him up. It's on the Koran website. I don't know what it's called in English, but it's published by Koran Publishers, and it's about prayer, and it's by somebody called Dov Zinger. And I've been to various also workshops by some of the people who he works with. My daughter actually took me to the launch of the book, a launch of the book in Yerushalayim, and he said an amazing thing to do with silence. He said, sometimes we say, well, God didn't listen to our prayers. God didn't answer my prayers. He said, let's say you went to the Kotel and you prayed for 15 minutes. He said, well, I've got an idea for you. He says, did you try and be silent afterwards? Because maybe you'll hear God answer you. And we that's a bit strange. He said, 1 second. He said, just stand there. You spent 15 minutes praying. Stand there 15 minutes in silence. Just allow it 15 minutes in silence. Just stand there in silence. He said, I promise you, you'll have an answer. Now that's amazing. You could say that's just psychology, but his impression was that if well, the problem is we pray and we just walk away. And maybe we need a bit of silence in order to hear the answer. And it's so interesting, Richard, that you mentioned that maybe silence in prayer. I do use silence in prayer, and he was very much encouraged us. I mean, in the hall there and then, he said, you know what, we're just going to be silent for 2 minutes. Let's just be silent and stop talking. And he just let the silence be. And I sometimes do find that a very powerful thing in tefillah. You know, while you're having kavanah, while you're thinking, just sometimes just be silent for a minute, and something very powerful about that. So as I say, so let's analyze what we've said about silence. We saw that there's a relationship between words and action, and that maybe less talk and more action. We saw Rabbi Shem Gamliel say, "Lo matzati leguf tov el shtika." Anybody who has too many words brings sin. And we said you could have inappropriate speech, and therefore silence is good. It could be that silence achieves a degree of sanctity. Rav Volba is saying that silence helps you to achieve a certain sense of, you know, if it wasn't for the night, we wouldn't know about the stars. You can't have too much noise around you, else you don't know yourself inside. And we've just suggested that prayer could be an interesting tool silence could be a very interesting tool within the context of prayer. So there you have it. Okay, so let's move on to talk a little bit about speech. And we're going to pay attention to the work of Rabbi Jonathan Sacks. And I found an amazing tendency in Rabbi Sacks to talk about the creative power of words. And rather than focus on Lashon Hara, Rabbi Sacks, with his great optimism and hope, spoke about Lashon Tov. He was insistent that language should be used, instead of focusing on refraining, that we should use our language for good. First thing I'll start off is the idea that he says that language is the tool of creation. If you take a look here in source 7, Bidvar Hashem Shamayim Nasu, from Tehillim Lamed Gimel. By the word of God, the heavens were made, over Piv, and through this breath of his mouth, called Sfa'am. Kones Koneg Me'ayam, he gathered all the sea, Notem Botzerot Tomot, Yiru Be'Hashem Kol Haaretz Mimenu Yagiru Kol Yoshvei Tevel, Ki Hu Amar Vayehi, he spoke, and it was. He commanded, and it endured. In other words, how did God create the world? We know the line, Vayomer Elokim Yehi Or. You know, you go through the Babylonian myths and the myths from all, gods are very busy. They're busy chopping things up and killing people and, you know, fashioning things. How did God create the world? He spoke, right? Yehi Or, Yehi Rakia B'toch Hamayim, right? God is always speaking. Naseh Adam B'tzalmeinu Kidmotenu, right? Certainly in chapter 1, we have the notion of God speaking. And we have this phrase in Pirkei Avot, the world was created with 10 utterances. You know, let me take this a stage further. Rabbi Sacks says that not only in the physical sense is God a creator through words, but that we have the notion of relationships being created through words. And let me give you an example of the first relationship. The first relationship was the relationship between Adam and Chava. Adam and Chava had the first relationship. And how did Adam marry Eve? Well, the answer is that he woke up one morning and there was a woman next to him. You know, he'd fallen asleep, and he says, "Etzem me'atzamai ubasar mebsari lezot tikare isha kemi ish lukach hazot." Rabbi Sacks notes something remarkable. He says that, first of all, the relationship was created by a poem, by poetry. Second of all, that until this point in history, Adam has only been called Adam. But in this line, he says, oh, you're not Adam, you are Isha. And he says, you're Isha because you were taken from Ish. He says, notice that he pronounces her name before he pronounces his new name. He tries to find an egalitarian name. He can't call her, he's Adam, he can't call her Adama, because that's where he came from. So he comes up with Ish and Isha. And he says, in order to know somebody, you have to pronounce the name of the other before you pronounce your own name. But the idea that we create relationships by a speech. And Rabbi Sachs says that when speech fails, relationships fail and violence begins. So, for example, with the Joseph story, when the brothers cannot talk peaceably to their brother, when they cannot talk, violence begins. And if I come to this week's Parshat Shavua, how do the Jewish people pledge their allegiance to God? With words. Na'aseh v'nishma. You know what? Let's go back. How does God build his relationship with the Jewish people? Through words, through the Aseret HaDibrot. Words are very creative. I'm going to skip source 9. I'll come back to it. But let's go to source 10, and then we'll come back to source 9. Source 10.
I just want to jump in. Some nice comments in the chat and the Q&A related to the 2 sources ago about silent prayer. No direct questions, just
okay, great. Okay, so he says like this. Words not only allow us to communicate, they enable us to form partnerships, for I can use language not just to describe facts and express feelings, but also to create a moral bond, to promise, to bind, to commit myself. That is what is called a performative utterance, meaning the use of language to create something that did not exist before. Let me just pause and say, for Rabbi Sachs, language, of course, can be descriptive, right? I can say, this is a pen, that is a cat. But language can be creative. It can create new realities. And that is in the case of the performative utterance, meaning the use of language to create something that did not exist before. So, for example, when I promise to do something, I create an obligation. When standing under the bridal canopy, I say, Harei at Mekudesh li. I create a new transformative relationship, the relationship of marriage. So interested that marriage is created by words, and I would argue a lot of times it's sustained or ruined by positive or negative language. And he says, just as God creates the natural world with words, so we create the social words with words, sacred words, meaning words that bind. Words that bind. This is the first intimation of an idea on which eventually all Jewish history will turn, the idea of a covenant. And now I jump to this week's Parshat Shavua. Something else happened at Sinai that had not happened before. God tells Moses to announce the nature of the covenant before making it, and to see whether the people agree. They do so no less than 3 times. In Exodus 19, before the 10 Commandments, the people answered as one, saying, all the Lord has spoken, we will do. Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh. The people all responded with a single voice, we will do everything the Lord has spoken. And in this week's Parshat Shavua, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. This is the first time in history that we encounter the phenomenon enshrined in the American Declaration of Independence, namely the consent of the governed. God only spoke the 10 Commandments after the people had signaled that they had given their consent to be bound by his word. God does not impose his rule by force. At Sinai, covenant making became mutual. Both sides had to agree. So we have this notion of words that bind, and that in fact it was words that bound us to God. And I'm going to take this one stage further, where he talks about words binding, creating trust. I'll put it this way, you can create a society by force of law, by imposing force, or by creating a buy-in. Okay? So if words create, because words are holy, that is to say they bind. When words bind, they generate trust. Trust is to society what predictability is to nature, the basis of order as opposed to chaos. If trust breaks down, social relationships break down. And then society depends on law enforcement agencies or some other use of force. When force is widely used, society isn't free. The only way free human beings can form collaborative and cooperative relationships without recourse to force is by the use of verbal undertakings honored by those who make them. In other words, we agree to obey the law. Although it sounds strange to us now, the father of toleration and liberalism, John Locke, held that citizenship should not be extended to atheists because not believing in God, they couldn't be trusted to honor their word. Isn't that amazing? So he says in Bamidbar, when they talk about laws about vows and oaths, as the Israelites are approaching their land, is no accident. And the moral is still relevant today. A free society depends on trust. Trust depends on keeping your word. That's how humans imitate God, by using language to create. Words create moral obligations,
and moral obligations undertaken responsibly and honored faithfully create the possibility of a free society. Wow, that is quite powerful. In other words, God creates the world through words. We create relationships through words. Words bind. Words create trust. And a free society, either we have a police society where law has to be imposed by force, or we trust people. Trusting people means that when I say I'll pay, you will pay. That when I say, you keep the rules. So I find that quite an amazing thing. Okay, that's true in families, right? You say you'll do something, and if you don't do it for long enough, then people get upset. We expect to live up to our word. What was the phrase in the old world when you wanted to say somebody was a good person? His word is his bond, right? So I think that's a very powerful idea about words and the power of words, but I want to take it even a stage further. And for this, I'm going to go back to source number 9. And this is really one of my favorite teachings of Rabbi Sachs, which I actually heard from him in person. And he says, Judaism is a sustained meditation on the power of words to heal or harm, mend or destroy. Just as God created the world with words, so we create and can destroy relationships with words. I think important to say destroy. The Rabbi said much of Lashon Hara, but virtually nothing about the corollary Lashon Tov, good speech. So Rabbi Sachs does, and this is what he says. And he quotes a Mishnah, which is a rather strange Mishnah. I'll read it with you. Again, from Pirkei Avot. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 disciples, Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus, Rabbi Shimon ben Chananya, Rabbi Yossi HaKohen, Rabbi Shimon ben Netanel, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Arach. He counted their plays. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus bor sud she'eina ma'abein tipa. Eliezer ben Hyrcanus had an amazing memory. He was like a well or a plastered cistern, it should say, that never loses a drop. Yeshua ben Chananya, Ashrei Eladetu. Yossi HaKohen, Chassid. Shimon ben Netanel, Yirei Chet. Elazar ben Arach, K'ma'ayan HaMitgaber. And Rabbi Sachs asked the question, and he said, what exactly do you learn from this Mishnah? Because all I'm telling you is that these people had certain virtues. And he basically says like this: language can be descriptive, but language can be creative. So let me try and put it in our terms. Imagine that you're in school. You do all sorts of topics. You do maths and you do art, you do English and you do science, you do sport and you do languages. And as most young people are, I was, you don't know what to do. You say, what should I do when I grow up? Right? Some people are still asking that question, but okay. What should I do when I grow up? Well, imagine you had a teacher and the teacher looks at you and says, you've got a real talent for numbers. Wow, you've got an amazing way with words. Suddenly, you start saying, well, you know what, I'm going to put a bit more effort in that direction. He noticed something about me. Said Rabbi Sachs, that's exactly what Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was doing. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was saying he looked at each one of his students and he praised them. And by praising them, he brought out something in them, which was a potential, which they didn't even necessarily realize they had. The use of praise, the use of language, was actually creative. It was Lashon Tov. It created something that hadn't been there before. When we compliment somebody, wow, you're such an elegant host, especially if it's pointed praise, which is real. It's not just, something which we'd say to everybody. But you actually notice about somebody and you say to them, wow, you've got such a great way at opening conversations. And then a person will think about that and maybe hone that skill. You create something where somebody becomes more self-aware and builds themselves. So Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai had 5 students, and Rabbi Eliezer ben Hyrcanus didn't necessarily realize he had an exceptional memory. But when Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai said to him, wow, you don't lose a drop, right? That's really amazing. He said, you know what, I'm going to start working on remembering remembering Torah. I remember I once had a guy who sat next to me in yeshiva, and he told me that during the time that he was in the army, he'd been learning Mishnayot Ba'al Peh, and he'd learned a Seder and a half of Mishnah, Ba'al Peh, like a quarter of the Mishnah, by heart, while he was doing Shmirah in the army. I was like blown away. Who has such an amazing memory? And then he said to Rabbi Elazar ben Arach, you are like a ever-flowing spring. In other words, you're so creative. And again, I remember such stories. You know, I went to yeshiva, and they say, Ein bet midrash lelo chidush. There's no bet midrash without a novelty. And I always used to wait to have chidushim. I had a book on my desk where I write my chidushim, and I had about 2 chidushim in it, and it drove me crazy. And I was like, I'm the worst yeshiva student ever. And then one day, the penny dropped. I said, you know what? I'm not so good at my own chidushim, but I'm really good at presenting other people's chidushim. In fact, I'm really good at building shirim of this person's thought and that person's thought and that person's thought. I'm a good presenter. And you know what? I stopped trying to be what I wasn't, which was a very, very daring novel thinker. And I started being, instead of a Rosh Yeshiva, I said, I'll be a teacher and I'll be a presenter and I'll try and teach clearly. And I think that's what I've managed to do in my career. But it was liberating. It was liberating because that realization, that, says Rabbi Sachs, is what Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai did for his students. And I'll just finish the passage here because I love it. And he says, okay, I'll you can look at the Ketz Amaraktim, but I will. Okay, here we go. The end of page 4. Rabbi Yochanan Zakkai, when he praised his students, showing them their specific strength, and that is Lashon Tov. Evil speech diminishes us. Good speech helps us grow. Evil speech puts people down. Good speech lifts them up. Focused, targeted praise, informed by considered judgment of individual strength and sustained by faith in people and their potentiality, is what makes teachers great and their disciples greater than they would otherwise have been. That is what we learn from Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. And that's what Rabbi Sachs called Lashon Tov, that we have the ability in our language. We focus so much on Lashon Hara, but we don't think about how often we can say a good word to somebody, an encouraging word, a word when somebody looks down, a word which of praise. We can give a bit of advice to somebody or help a new person at work, and use our language for good. So what I hope I've done in this class is I've stayed away from the paradigms which are very frequently used in Jewish classes, which is to say, oh, don't talk Lashon Hara and, minimize speech. So, what I've tried to say is that there are different dimensions of silence. Silence which causes introspection, silence which can allow us to maybe hear God. And then there is speech, which speech isn't only bad, it's good. I would also argue, by the way, like Rabbi Sachs, we build our social world through speech. I love having a good conversation with a friend. How often, I just read a book by David Brooks, now forgetting what it's called, but it's all about getting to know people deeply, seeing people deeply, and being seen deeply. And he says there are people who are illuminators and there are diminishers, right? How often have you had a boss who is a diminisher and a boss who is an illuminator, right? And that's exactly what we're saying. Lashon Hara is when you are a diminisher, when you put somebody down with your language, when you use language in a conversation, and there's nothing elevating by the language. Whereas when you praise, when you use language for good, you become an illuminator. You illuminate the environment around you. And that is a fabulous thing to do. So that's a bit about speech and silence. Lashon Hara, Lashon Tov. May we be zocher. May we be zocher to be illuminators and to use our language and our silence in order to enhance both our body and our social environment. That's it. This Friday is Rosh Chodesh Adar Aleph. And I think we're going to use the opportunity to talk next time about joy. And we might even do this over 2 weeks, I'm not sure, but we're going to talk about happiness, joy. Is Judaism pro-happiness? There's that phrase, mitzvah gedolah liot b'simcha. Is that true? And does that mean jumping up and down like, Breslovers at a traffic light? Is that what it's about? Or is there something, else that we can talk about in that regard? So we're going to talk about happiness and joy, and that we'll meet again next week. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sharing, everyone who shared comments, whether it's speaking or in the various chats. I hope to see you all next week. Take care and have a good day.